So what's the one big trend that marketers and media leaders are not paying enough attention to right now?
It kind of depends on which level you're looking at.
Today, we have none other than renowned Ian Whitaker, who was twice named City AM Analyst of the Year.
You've got to understand what the business is trying to get for, what's in the mind of the CEO and the CFO to actually get to the point of where marketing fits into that equation. There's going to be a question here, how they're going to get through continual price increases to their consumers. My answer to that:
He shares why brand strength is the true superpower at a time of rising prices, and how AI might just be our generation's industrial revolution.
Tech companies, given how much they've spent on AI and their plans, they have to make AI work. If they don't make AI work, there's going to be a lot of angry investors out there.
Expect bold metaphors, military history references, and a masterclass in joining the dots across macroeconomics, media, marketing, and growth. So let's dive right in.
Ian, welcome. Great to have you on the show with us.
Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you, Richie. It's great to be here.
Indeed. So you're a seasoned podcast host yourself, but this is the shoe on the other foot.
Oh, no, damn.
We'll be kind. We'll be kind.
Yeah.
Well,
Maybe not.
No, don't.
no. So Ian, just your thing in the world is intersecting macroeconomic forces and media and marketing trends, and then you bring a dollop of military history in. So I think we're going to have a super conversation today, and I want to sort of get straight into it, really. So I guess in joining the dots between macroeconomic forces and media and marketing trends, you've got a great purview. You're an advisor to many. You see the market in its totality. So what's the one big trend that marketers and media leaders are not paying enough attention to right now?
No, it's a really, really good question. And I guess it kind of depends on which level you're looking at. You know, whether you're thinking about, if you want to take like the higher level, the sort of geopolitical, and how that then feeds down, or maybe a little bit sort of below. I'll actually get, let's actually give more value for the money. I'll give you a couple that I don't necessarily think are sort of people are looking at. So the first thing I'd say is that, we're not in 4 years of Trump, we're in 12 years of Vance. Okay, that everyone is focusing on the presidency of Trump at the moment and what that actually means, but this is part of a longer trend. And certainly, if you look at and this is one I would say for more political junkies than anything else, but if you look at the US political cycle and you look at where things are, certainly in terms of the electoral map moving forwards and where things are likely to change, it's very, very likely that we're going to have sort of a Republican administration for a number of years. We're not just talking 4 years, we're probably sort of a decade and more. Now, why is that important from an advertiser standpoint and for people in marketing? Well, that will drive the decisions of many of many companies for a start, but also as well, if you think about some of the trade policies that have been coming through and the impact they've had on advertising, we think about what's happening in terms of the dispute with China, with tariffs, with the elimination of the de minimis tariff of customs exemption that has had an impact in terms of people like of Shine and Temu selling into the US market. And now they're looking to reorientate towards Western Europe on there. And funnily enough, as I was coming here, of all down the walkway for the Jubilee line interchange at Waterloo, all it was covered from was of advertisements for Alibaba.com, talking about how you could order 100 chairs, as long as, minimum order, was something like £6.23. But the point being is that is shifting the way that Chinese manufacturers are selling their goods. And if you think about it, there's really been three big drivers of global advertising spend over the past 10 to 15 years. Those are SMEs that effectively have gone online, and it's been a transfer of spend that they would have spent in the property sector in terms of shop fronts. They're now going online. The second thing is private equity and venture capital in terms of their spending on growth. And the third thing has been Chinese advertisers coming into the market as well. So, what we have is a geopolitical trend, then feeds down into what we're seeing in advertising. I think the second thing, this is the extra bit that juicy bit we'll add for you, is that what we're likely to see moving forwards in terms of the world is there is a permanent uptick in terms of inflation. So the 10, 15 years that we had pre-2022, where you had inflation rate 0 to 1%, that's pretty much gone. We're probably in a world now where it's 2-3%, maybe a little bit more. Now, that may not seem that much, but when you compound that over a number of years, has a particular impact in terms of pricing. And so for many firms, for example, particularly advertisers, there's going to be a question here, how they're going to get through continual price increases to their consumers at a point where consumers have already felt, we've had 2 years of big price increases, many of them are feeling under pressure. How are you going to get more price increases through? My answer to that would be you need to spend more on brand advertising.
Hallelujah.
Indeed, hallelujah. But then it's also got another fact. If you have that level of inflation, you're likely to see interest rates go down by that much. If you don't see interest rates go down by that much, then you're probably not going to get a resurgence coming through in private equity and venture capital, which, to go back to the point before, was one of the big drivers of advertising spend over the past 10 to 15 years, pre-2022, 2023. So all these trends all sort of connect into one another, even though they may seem at first sight as though they have very little to actually sort of interact with.
Ian, wow, you've given us a smorgasbord of insight. And in fact, it's kind of, my mind is going to the conversation or the talk that we were at last week with the editor-in-chief of The Economist.
Yeah.
And very much sort of that thought process. And actually, some of your thought process is something that she's echoed too. But she then came on to it quite reluctantly to the UK and kind of almost went, I don't want to end on a slightly negative tangent. But then she did. But therefore, I want to kind of just get your sense of, we've heard a little bit about the US, and we've certainly heard about some of the repercussions here at Waterloo and the like. But what is your take on the UK scene, macro, but implications on marketing and advertising as well?
Well, yeah, if I look at the US, the UK, not the US. If I look at the UK macro side, mixed. I mean, look, you have a lot of wealth in this country. You have a lot of consumers who are actually doing very well. If you work in certain sort of professions, you do have a nice life. People are still spending. It is a consumer-led economy and so forth. Having said that, we have huge problems in terms of polarization of wealth. There is a large percentage of the population that essentially doesn't have that much to spend. I mean, if you take, for example, housing, you've got a third of the country that essentially are homeowners with no mortgage. From their standpoint, they're doing absolutely fine. You've got another third that essentially are homeowners with a mortgage. They have been under pressure as mortgage rates have gone significantly up because of what's happening with sort of interest rates. So I would say that sort of macro-wise, UK doesn't look particularly fantastic. It's okay. I don't think there's going to be much that the government does that, quite frankly, reinvigorates the economy. The risk is probably more on the downside than anything else, just because you look at what's happening with the Labour Party at the moment. The left wing sort of tendencies seem to be coming out again. That will have an implication for where things go. I think when it comes to advertising, it's a different level. And one thing I would point out is the assumption that is often made that advertising spending is driven by things like GDP growth and consumer confidence, etc. It's actually not. What it's driven by is corporate profitability. Because at the end of the day, it is corporates who spend sort of the money. And if you look for a lot of the advertising spend that is done in the UK, a lot of it is driven out of US headquartered companies. And if you look at US corporate profits, and I guess we could have chucked that into one of the greatest, the bigger trends that you're seeing, look at US corporate profits over the past 5 years, they've nearly doubled. Yeah. So just over $2 trillion to around $4 trillion. Okay. And it is the fact that essentially, even though GDP growth has not been that great, it is the fact that you've had corporates actually doing so well in terms of their profitability that has really kept the advertising growth going. So from a UK advertising market standpoint, actually, I think things will be relatively good. And again, you've got the bits that you would see, the agencies would see, the big corporates. And then, of course, you have the continued spend that, as it were, bypasses the things like the SMEs, the things also as well, increasingly, as was mentioned before, Chinese-based advertisers looking to sell into the UK market.
So I think there's a lot of triangulation that goes on in your brain, like joining the dots, pulling things together. and I remember conversations we've had before. This marketing trend is like the 17th century Spanish. Da, 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 da. So I'm going to do a 2-for-1. Cardinal sin of a podcast.
Yeah.
First question: how does your brain work? And then the second question is your favorite military metaphor as it relates to something in marketing.
Okay. How does my brain work? Carl, that's a scale. Is that for public consumption? I don't know. I am,
To be revealed here first.
Yeah,
Have you
well.
ever been asked that question before?
No, I haven't been asked that question before with things. I mean, I think it's, right. I think it was Winston Churchill. I'm going to paraphrase him here, who said the further you can reach back into history, the more useful examples you can get. That was essentially sort of what he was saying. And, how my brain works is because the background I've had as a historian, sort of more recently a war historian, also as well sort of working in the financial markets for 20 years. So, and working in the media industries as well. It brings together finance sort of historical examples, which are always great for bringing things up. I call it the toolbox of history. You can reach into it and sort of pick up tools that are generally useful in a whole range of circumstances that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Yeah, and how that all works is bringing that all together with the macroeconomic side and what I know about advertising. And as you say, it's just thinking, okay, well, we've got this sort of seeing this trend here, but usually what you realize from history is that things, very rarely are they sort of uniquely new. They tend to have had some sort of pattern somewhere before. And so really it's, I guess you'd almost call it like, the mind is going, you see this thing and you go, right, drill down and think, what sort of examples can I pull from here where this, what's happening looks to have the closest parable to. And some of it may be, completely random. So I think, for example, what's happening in the marketing industry at the moment, the amount of words, conferences, presentations, research, etc., that is sort of dealt with areas like attribution, measurement, all those things. To me, reminds me sort of the most of, in history, of medieval theologians discussing how many angels you can fit on a pinhead, right? It is drilling down into the real minutiae of stuff, and quite frankly, they've gone down the rabbit hole and actually missing the main point of advertising. And if I was to simplify things, and I said I'm an outsider looking at things from a different perspective. For me, the only thing that counts, or the only example you need to show how advertising works, is to go back into sort of what happened in 2022 and 2023 and look at what happened with many firms in terms of they had a whole load of input costs that they needed to pass through to consumers. They were all panicking they wouldn't be able to do it because they said, you know what, our sort of pricing models are telling us we can't do it. And the reason they managed to succeed and they got their price increases through and more was off the strength of their brand. And that's what they said in their conference calls. It was the strength of their brand that enabled them to push through their price increases, which enabled them to go back to the comment I made before, the drive near doubling of US corporate profitability. That has been primarily driven by price increases that have gone through to the consumer. Those price increases, the main driver of that has been the strength of brand that has persuaded many consumers to actually spend. Yes, consumers had money at the time and so forth, but if the brands weren't strong, the consumers wouldn't spend. And as far as I'm concerned, that is the only piece of evidence that you need to show that advertising works.
Today's program is brought to you by two fantastic organizations. First up is Studio Space, a leading on-demand marketing agency platform. Studio Space gives marketers complete control over their projects, from matching the right agency to your brief, to managing contracts and invoicing, and even tracking all of your spend data all in the one place. They take care of everything and it's totally hassle-free. They even guarantee the work. So check out Studio Space today. Our second sponsor is the Marketing Skills Trust, a charity with a mission to make marketing a better place for everyone. They provide grants to help create a more equitable industry and support initiatives that really do drive diversity, inclusion, and create opportunity. The trust has been instrumental in leveling up the marketing skills across the board. And do take a look at their website for more information. Now, let's get on with the show.
You're then basically talking about a very narrow, defined set of major brands that will then sit. It seems fairly do or die in that scenario then, if you're describing it that way.
Sorry, do or die in terms of...
In terms of the fact that if you've got smaller, challenger, upcoming, right, the Davids versus what you're describing as the Goliaths, and then price increasing, and then you're saying, well, the Goliaths are able to do that more effectively because of brand value. What happens to the Davids of the world?
Well, there's still plenty of room left for the Davids, of course. Well, if you think about it, you've got huge brand value. It's not going to appeal to everyone. You know, if you're putting up your prices, there is the ability to actually for challengers to come in there, particularly in this sort of environment as well, where, yes, you know, firms are very much driven by profit. That can mean in many cases they'll let the service standards slip, or people are concerned about the pricing, or something of that. I don't think there is of the idea that the mega brands will just dominate in this world. Sure, it means they're able to push through price increases, but if you've got a good product and a good service, you'll always be able to find someone in this world to buy.
You know, you often talk about and do a lot of intense analysis on streaming services. Really intriguing. In fact, that's, I feel, some of your best work in terms of your analytics work. Tell us a little bit more about that streaming wars that it were, given the historical context, military feedback that you just gave us. I mean, what's the intensity of that space at the moment? And I know you talked about the fact that there's unlikely to be many winners or any, but beyond that, I'd love to get your perspective on.
Yeah, so the analogy, I mean, I published a report back in February 2022, which was around 2 or 3 days before the Russians invaded Ukraine. So the timing of it wasn't particularly great, because the analogy I made was the streaming wars were like World War I. And the point being with there is that everyone expected a quick victory and that things would be fine, but actually things went on for a lot longer, and it ended up costing a lot of the players, even the victors. Yeah, it was very much a Pyrrhic victory. And I think where we are standing in the streaming wars at the moment, the talk that we've heard that, for example, YouTube is the winner of the streaming wars. I've written on this before, so it's nothing new, but the whole idea that you could claim somebody with 12.5% share, talking about the US here, is a winner. You never get any war where essentially that would be the case. But what you have got, I would argue, is almost of several different levels. I think one is that you've got of WISP when it comes to the number of let's call them combatants of within the play. I don't see any exiting of any major players soon. Yes, they are setting themselves up for consolidation. However, the fact that they've moved to profitability is reducing the pressure they're getting from shareholders to actually merge. Now that they're actually starting to make a little bit of money, and the emphasis on a little bit, shareholders are more relaxed about the fact of, okay, what they're doing. But at the same time as well, they're not going to go for growth, right? And if you look at the markets at the moment, most of the major Western European, US markets, they're at saturation levels. US is 85% penetrated. UK, for example, is around 70%. It's not going to get that much more above there. So first of all, stalemate, okay? And this is where we'd use the example of World War I. It's effectively like the Western Front in 1917. I mean, there is not that much movement that is going on despite the amount of money that is being chucked into it. The second thing is that would almost say what you've got is you've got several different battlefields, if you want to talk about it in that way. And you could split by geography and you could split by type. And the four major ones would identify are the US pay TV and free-to-air network, or not free-to-air networks, but the broadcasters. And then you've got, in terms of Europe, similar sort of thing, pay TV, and then also as well broadcasters. The way that would define things is, if you look at the US, I think the streamers have definitely won in terms of the battle for pay TV. They have largely won in terms of TV networks, but there will always be a TV role for the TV networks. And then I think in Europe, it's a bit more interesting. If you take, in terms of pay TV, it's stalemate, but it really depends on what happens with things like football longer term. However, I think for the broadcasters within Europe, I would argue that certainly when it comes to the main streaming organisations, that actually it's looking more and more as though it'll be victory. And what I mean by victory is that they would have beaten off the threat that the streamers would have presented to them.
Streamers being YouTube.
Well, YouTube, Netflix, I mean, you've got this transition now where essentially what we thought of streamers a couple of years ago was the Netflix, the HBO Max, everyone like that. Now what you've got is if we could do another historical analogy here, but I don't want to overload people with others. But it's almost sort of what you've got here is that you've got, the streamers and the broadcasters have been battling each other, and then you've got almost like a new entity that has come in terms of YouTube, trying to, as it were, sort of burst into the scene of both of those. I mean, on the YouTube question, my view is it's not really TV. Yeah, it is something different, but quite frankly, there are a hell of a lot of questions about YouTube that still need answered. What is the view? What is the percentage of content that is somebody else's? Whether that be music, whether that be other broadcasters, which content producers. I think Evan Shapiro put something up recently looking at the top 50 YouTube channels, 15 were out of India. So, have we got, I think it was something like 5 out of Europe, none was out of the UK. Okay. Yeah. Have we got some sort of, and we don't get that much visibility from YouTube in terms of their advertising numbers, where the ad revenues are coming from. So is it that certain markets, it is more like TV, certain markets it's not? Could we say, for example, in India that is benefited from the ban from TikTok, and that's had a ripple effect? I think what we need here when it comes to streaming is you've got a gradual sort of depreciation of the amount of information that we get. The pay TV operators and the broadcasters, were quite transparent. The streamers are less, and YouTube has gone down another level.
Love the depth of insight, and again, the triangulation, the military history. I'm going to go back 2 answers to your point you made about advertising and brand supports premiumization and profitability. And so my question is, where does it all go wrong? Because marketing should be the best friend of CFOs. And yet, whether it's the language or the approach or the rigor, we all know that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
All too often, marketing is the cliche of the colouring in function. But all too often, it just never really fires. And CFOs see advertising as a cost and don't ever join the dots to how it can benefit the business. Yeah. So in your view, many people have commented on this, but what's your spin on where it all goes wrong?
Well, I think language is definitely a key point, with things. I would say that marketers need to speak the language of the CFO. Of course I would. I mean, I've been saying that for years and years and years.
Why is nobody listening?
I trademarked the damn thing. I mean, of course I'm going to be saying it's true. But there is this element of the, title of the famous book, Women are from Venus and Men from Mars. That there is this element that you get the two sides sort of speaking sort of in different language and therefore don't understand sort of one another. I think another key thing also as well is, and this is sort of, I made this point recently, and it was quite interesting that I would say the people who were more on the advertising side sort of were very much against the point I made, and the people on the finance side actually were like, yeah, this is true. That I think one of the things that you get with the advertising industry when it's trying to sort of explain its effectiveness is that it'll produce another study and it'll go, this is proof that marketing works. And the thing that coming from from an analyst background, from a finance background, I've always said is it's not the output that counts, it's the strength of the inputs. And I think this is, that CFOs and CEOs, quite frankly, do not have enough confidence in the intellectual rigor that has gone sort of into the analysis. And it all boils down to trust. What you got to remember is CEOs and CFOs have a boss, right? And that's investors of listed companies. Yeah, and they've got to go out there and they've got to defend their stance. And if they don't really understand what you're doing, and more to the point, they don't feel confident they can trust you in terms of what you've delivered, and it is, it's credible and it stands up to scrutiny, then they're not going to defend you. And I think that has been the problem for a long time with marketing. There hasn't been that trust. You see organizations where there is that trust, the likes of a Unilever, for example, they spend on marketing. Yeah.
What builds that trust? Obviously, there's the classics that were marketing oriented from the day they were born, the Mars, the Unilevers, the P&Gs. But in other organizations, what makes the trust happen?
I think it is one of those things. I mean, it's a mixture of things. Many of them are soft skills. It's the ability to collaborate across finance and marketing teams. It's transparency, showing what you do. and showing the workings and being able, being open to criticism. It's taking the time, and the rigor to say, you know what, actually we need to stress test these assumptions and make sure they're absolutely fine. Get another side's input to see whether this works. I think from a marketing side, it's understanding what the business does itself and what its key priorities. Because again, things will travel downwards. You've got to understand what the business is trying to get for, what's in the mind of the CEO and the CFO to actually get to the point of where marketing fits into that equation. And I think, the other thing, one thing that would just sort of bear in mind in all this, CEOs and CFOs have only 24 hours in a day, like we all do, okay? So they're going to face constant pressures from sort of a lot of different areas. And if they don't if they don't understand what you do, they haven't got the time to look into it in detail. So therefore, it becomes about trust. It becomes about essentially, can they trust you to deliver and they feel comfortable with that? That, I think, is where the main failing has been historically. Now, I would say that actually I think there are signs that's changing. And again, it comes back to this point. If you want to look at it, the inflation crisis, one of my favorite phrases, was a vast and planned experiment in demonstrating the strength of brands. That for many CEOs and CFOs, what they realized was it was the strength of their brand that enabled them to drive profits. And one of the things that has been interesting within the Q1 financial results is that for many companies, even companies like Procter & Gamble that actually brought down their guidance, what they've done is they've doubled down on their advertising spending and say that we don't want to cut our spend for a quarter in order to impact the long term. Now, you look at that sort of pattern and you're seeing it repeated in terms of other firms as well, doubling down on ad spend. Previously, that would have been the first port of call for savings if companies wanted to meet their guidance. I would say, and it comes with the usual caveats, et cetera, we'll see how things go. But I would say that a lot of companies are looking at what's happening in the macroeconomic trends that we talked about before, but more importantly, what happened in a real life example, and saying, this is not an area that we can cut.
It's super refreshing because clearly that has not necessarily been the way it's been over the last few years. So I'm glad that there's a bit of a hope and a positive angle to this. I find it fascinating because you talk about the notion of trust. Clearly, a word that has come up again and again is brand in that sense. And anecdotally, through the conversations that me and Mark have been having, there are a lot of CMOs who feel like, again, talk about big buzzwords. Clearly, the biggest one on everyone's lips is the role of AI.
Yeah.
And that infiltrates across the C-suite, and particularly where you've got mandates from people like the CEO and the CFO to then go blanket cuts because we believe you can substitute better using an AI automation sort of a take on this. And so I wonder, to what extent do you feel that's actually translating, i.e. the world of AI is actually helping to become more efficient across the marketing funnel, and whether that will actually take place? Or indeed, do you think AI is going to play a greater role in the growth agenda for a marketer? So efficiency, cost, and revenue generation in the growth side. Do you think AI is going to play that role, or how hyped do you think we are at the moment?
Oh, I think we're super hyped, and look, the approach that I always say to companies that advise when it comes to AI is always remember the phrase of the Roman Emperor Augustus, "Festina lente," which Latin.
See what you did there.
Yeah, and what it means is make haste slowly. And the point being with that is that many firms at the moment, they are rushing in to sort of believing that they have worked out what the implications from AI are, and therefore for their business. My view is companies can afford to actually take some time to actually work through properly what's going to be the implications for this. Because the other thing that you've got sort of with this as well is, obviously it's a powerful technology. There's no doubt about that. However, you've also got to take into account as well that the tech companies are spending tens of billions of dollars each on this technology, that you've got valuation for AI firms going through the roof, that you've got people like Sam Altman who will make a hell of a lot of money, sort of regardless of non-profit status or whatever. But in terms of AI comes true, there's a lot, I would say, there's a lot of people in the AI industry that have sort of have a very, very strong incentive to talk up the benefits of AI.
Brand building of AI.
Yeah, and also bear in mind as well, so do the tech companies. Because I go back to that point before that every CEO and CFO has a boss and that's their investors. Tech companies, given how much they've spent on AI and their plans, they have to make AI work. If they don't make AI work, then quite frankly, there's going to be a lot of angry investors out there. There's going to be a lot of angry investors in terms of venture capital and private equity. There's going to be a lot of people saying this was essentially a bubble that was driven too far. And so I think you've got to differentiate between some of the, let's call it hype, or some of the claims that have been made, because they're not being made in, let's call it, a neutral fashion. There is a large degree of self-interest there. Now, having said that, this could also become a self-fulfilling prophecy. That, with the amount of money that's spent on AI and what people are talking about, the vision, that firms buy into it, and therefore sort of it becomes very much of a force of, force of nature by itself, sort of roles to replace so on. The one thing I would say, it's, well, maybe I'll sort of, there's an interesting analogy here with the Industrial Revolution that we can come back to.
Yep.
But sort of, I would say when it comes to advertising and marketing, I think it would be best at the moment, for the industry to say we don't necessarily need to rush into a decision right now. The only thing I would say, the bigger threat I think that's probably to the industry is, and it sort of comes back to this point that we're saying sort of before about the three growth drivers of advertising spend in the world. Those three big growth drivers, A, they disproportionately benefited the online companies, and B, they are now grinding to a halt. Combine that with the amount of money that those firms are spending in terms of AI, you have a potential crisis there, certainly from a share price perspective. Okay? Yeah, if you want to look at things, and as usual, this is not investment advice.
Of course.
But,
we should have said that at the beginning.
Yeah. But, there is that sort of they do have to please the financial markets. And so, when you look at that sort of scenario where you get slowing growth and you got a huge amount of investments to get, if the advertising market is not growing that much, and you've got a huge amount of investments to actually fund, you need to find that money from somewhere. And the obvious way, or the obvious sort of area to find that money from, is from other people's spend. And this is one of the things that I think you will get the implications in terms of advertising, marketing spend is you're going to see a lot more aggressive pushes coming through from the major tech giants for other pots of money. Whether that be TV advertising money, whether it actually be agency money, whether it be ad tech money.
Or cloud or other revenue.
Exactly.
The AWS phenomenon. So I hear all that, Ian, but then also I hear people saying my SEO route to market is vanishing in front of my eyes. I'm seeing heavy click inflation as a result. So from a bottom of funnel search perspective, how far and how fast is this moving? And does the top-up question would be, does this result in a return to top of funnel? So, but what's your take on the dynamics around search?
Yeah, no. And look, I'm not an SEO. I don't work in the SEO industry, so you're going to have to excuse my ignorance sort of with this. But what I would say is that, if you take this from the point of view that Google has, 85% share of the search market, that's what it's been historically. Is AI, ChatGPT, all the other forms, is it going to replace that overnight? Absolutely not. What would say is that people tend to form habits, and people have got used to the habit of Google search. And I think, we talk about AI, but for a lot of people, AI doesn't really matter in terms of their direct use. They haven't got a ChatGPT account. They're not using AI. They're just getting on with their lives and so forth. However, if you are sort of Google, you only need your percentage share to go down from 85% to 75%, and that has a major financial sort of impact on things. And that's the thing where I think you've probably got more of a threat that comes through. That what you get is you get a gradual erosion that comes through, to come back to your point, that therefore inflates in price and so forth. And what you end up with is, it were, if you want to call it, a multipolar world when it comes to search. That instead of just saying, you know what, I could just go on Google and then that's it. You then realize that actually I need to replicate this. If you think about the market that Google sort of most clearly resembles historically, it's the Yellow Pages business, the classified directories. What was the sort of feature of classified directories? You would have sort of in each market one predominant player who would have a vastly inflated market share. Why? Because it benefited both advertisers and consumers to have one source of information. Advertisers wanted one source of consumers, consumers wanted one source of advertisers. That is the function that Google has very much performed over the past 15, 20 years. Now, if that breaks down and it becomes very fragmented, then obviously from a consumer standpoint, you now got to look across 6 different search engines to find what you want. And to come back to that point, and therefore, does it mean you should spend more on brand? I think that's absolutely the case. However, there's an interesting question there for your local sort of mum and pops. What do they do? Because what is, how, if you are a local hairdresser, what is your brand strategy when now, instead of just using Google, you're thinking that you've got to be on 4 to 5 sites and you want to go top of funnel?
Yeah.
So I think, I totally agree. I think it will drive top of funnel. However, I think for a lot of the people who are almost in that, and maybe they're outside the context of what people on this podcast are interested in, because they tend to be more towards a smaller scale. But what is the brand for those sorts of advertisers?
Before we skip off of AI, tell us about the Industrial Revolution metaphor.
Yeah, so, I mean, the optimal sort of case for the industrial, with AI is say, well, look at the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, the Industrial Revolution, sort of it helped, sort of, you had many more jobs created, it led to a vast generation, generating of wealth. Everyone was fearful of technology at the time, but look at what it meant for the world, and it was much sort of superior world afterwards, all of which is true, sort of when you look from a historical standpoint. But for the people who are actually living through it at the time, things were often very much different. So if you were the equivalent of the middle classes then, which would have been the artisan classes that would have been producing their goods at their homes on a spinning wheel, the Industrial Revolution was catastrophic. Because what it meant was that you had suddenly mechanization, which meant that however much you could get for your product before, suddenly the price collapsed because you had a lot more that was driven out. So actually, if you look at it, there is something like, I think in sort of the rough sort of parameter of this is correct. But I think, for example, in England in the 19th century, from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it took around 40 years for food consumption to actually sort of get back to where it was. The point being is that many, many households were impoverished because of that, because it just completely took away their livelihoods. And in fact, from a personal perspective, the Luddites were absolutely right. Yeah, in terms of destroying technology, because it was affecting their income. In terms of, wages increasing, that was very much sort of multi-generational. In terms of new jobs being created, the whole idea that, AI will create jobs that essentially we haven't even thought of before. Again, those took a number of decades to come through. Arguably, they also came about because of advances that we've already got now, and it's hard to see being replicated. For example, electricity that enabled lighting, which enabled sort of clerks to be employed in factories and so forth. So, people sort of tend to go to the Industrial Revolution, use it as a very sort of easy and quick analogy to say, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, everything will be fine with AI. If you actually drill down into the Industrial Revolution, look at the impact on the population, wages, what it actually meant in terms of, people living in the cities, at an individual level and for masses of society, was actually pretty catastrophic, from their personal standards. But what it did lead to was a greater concentration of wealth amongst the industrial owners.
and I can almost see that trend playing out again, where it's going to the few in that context. Ian, this is fascinating and of course slightly scary in the way that you've described it. I guess the question on everybody listening in's lips is going to be, what do I do? How do I, as best I can, protect myself from perhaps what could some of those potential fallouts be? I don't know if there's any crystal ball or certainly any advice or guidance that you might have. Maybe go pull back into history.
Yeah, no.
But it is a thought of, and I think it's something that's front of our minds. But like, what do we do today? Like, what is the thinking?
It's a really, really good question. Are you looking from an individual standpoint?
Yes.
You're looking from a...
Yes.
I mean...
How do I future-proof my standard of living, my wealth
Yeah.
creation, my family, their futures? I think under the surface, a lot of people are really asking these big, deep questions. So you're a
Yeah.
bright chap, so just tell us the answer.
Well, I think, well, that's very, very kind that you say that. There might be a few people who disagree with you on that, but I would say look around this table. I mean, we're all individuals who have been have had previous careers and have moved into something else. And what I would almost say is that I think in this sort of environment, and it's been the trend actually for decades, sort of more than anything else, but what you've got to do is, and it's a bit trite and it's a bit sort of soft in terms of the language, but you do have to take control of your own career, and I think increasingly the old days where what you could do is that you could rely on entering the workforce. And by the way, what we're going to see in AI, think about this, and again, it goes back to a slightly scary thought. Remember car factories. Back in the 70s, car factories used to employ 20, 30,000 people. Now they employ a couple of thousand at most, right? Yeah. It's all been automated. You need far fewer people. You obviously still need some workers, but you need far fewer people. And those jobs never came back. They transitioned into something else. People would say arguably many of those jobs weren't as good. I think we're seeing the same sort of thing coming through now in terms of the professional classes.
Yeah. And
that's not, other people have said that. But if I look at what are the drivers for things, it will be that firms, at the end of the day, firms want to make profits. Labor is often their biggest cost. The decision makers are those at the top and whose careers are already made. And I don't think this is, in many cases, you're going to see large scale cuts, particularly in professional jobs, soon. I think what will happen, it will be gradual. You start off, as you're already seeing, with you don't hire so many graduates. Then it's essentially, then there'll be certain tasks that get replaced. And again, the people at the top are doing okay, with things, but it's essentially lower down the chain where there's the impact. So where can people actually future-proof their career? Well, what I would almost say is it's not really thinking about the of specific items that you can do. It's more about the mindset that you have. Mm. And I would say it's more about the mindset of being able to say, you know what? I've got to look at myself and say, right, what is it about me that makes me special? What is about me that I've got strengths and what I'm really, really good at? Okay. And once I've done that, where is it that I can apply those things to? And it could be something that is completely out of of the orbit of what you do at the moment. But it could be something that, leads to, hugely great opportunities. I mean, I know with you, Mark, in terms of, what you've done, and where you some of the things that you're now looking at. Same with you, Richie. If I look at my own career, I was an equities analyst. Now, essentially, public speaking, writing, training course in terms of how to speak language CFO, podcast host. I wouldn't have thought of any of those things years and years ago. But what it is more of a mindset to be able to say, right, okay, A, I'm open to actually try new things, but B, also as well, what is it I bring to the party? And what is it that makes me different? Because everyone has got that. Everyone has got something that makes them special. This is not like an inspirational talk. I'm not like, whatever his name, Pete Robbins or anything like this. But it is true. Everyone has got something that makes them unique and where they've got an advantage. And it's working that out and then thinking from that, right, what can I do with this? And also, as well, as I say, trying to just make yourself as independent as possible.
By the way, in doing so, if you describe your own unique elements that you draw on today in terms of your career, you named a number of things, which I find quite fascinating.
Okay.
Because there'll be a lot of people here who have currently predominantly done one thing, one job. I wouldn't say linear career. Everyone today has had some sort of squiggly career in that sense. But I want to get your thought about, when you look at it from your own perspective, are you hedging bets or are you just doing things you enjoy in a fruit salad sort of way?
I would say it's a mixture of both. So, it is doing the things that I enjoy, which, from my standpoint, I love doing it. I mean, I write a lot on LinkedIn, but quite frankly, and exclusive here, if you want it, I will move into doing a Substack sort of thing. And I will, I'll charge for it. And the reason I'll do that is, essentially it is, because I can't write about the stuff on LinkedIn, so I need another platform. And I'll charge for it, one, obviously, because I want to make some money out of it. But two, also as well, the other thing that thinking about as well, which again, for me is like, I think you got to think about these things, is one of the things that always sort of hear about is you get graduates who are very bright, not being able to get a job because, they're finding it's hard for their first break. So what I would like to do, for example, is actually take some graduates on. And I don't expect them to stay with me, but at least they've got that sort of vital springboard of the first job that they can then take on to something else and so forth. And so what you can do sort of with this, going back to your question about what other people can do and so forth, is I think you've got to work out what actually does drive you. For me, that's important. I like my views being heard, but I would like to think, even though I actually worked in finance for 20 years, that I can give back something, something to somebody else. And so forth. But at the same time as well, what I don't want is reliance on one source. Because once you are reliant on one source, then what happens is you are always, always, always vulnerable.
So we're out of time. It's a great way to end because there's a call to action, to own it, defragilize, know what your thing is, what you enjoy doing. And specifically that point about graduate level, I think it's true that 1/3 of entry-level jobs have disappeared since OpenAI was created. So it's a pretty decent call to action and a great note to end on. It's been brilliant to have your thoughts and wisdom today. So thank you for joining us on the pod.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Richie.
Ian, it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.